Hogan pulled together a webinar on sustainable ag and food systems. And given that he and I are both in the funding world, we thought it might be interesting to take advantage of the access that we have to colleagues who are working with other funders to really try and coordinate and advance work on food systems and sustainable agriculture. So real quickly, in addition to Hugh, I'm going to hand things off to, who'll serve as moderator, we have with us Virginia Clark, who is Executive Director of the Sustainable Agriculture and Food Systems Funders Network. Yes, it's a mouthful, but it's similar to what we're trying to develop internally with Switzer Foundation. It's an affinity group of funders working from many different types of foundations across the country who all share an interest in food systems work, which, as many of you know, is a growing interest nationally and internationally. We also have Kolu Zigbee, who's Program Officer with the Jesse Smith Noyes Foundation, with one of our focuses, sustainable ag and food systems. And so as a program officer for a foundation with many program areas, of which this is one, we have a chance to really look at how one foundation is looking at this particular program area, as well as Hugh's effort to be involved, including with Kolu, locally and regionally in the New York City area. So with that, I'm going to kick it back over to Hugh and just thank everybody for your preparation as panelists and fellows as participants. Thanks.
Thanks. Excuse me so much, Lissa, and welcome to everyone onto the call, and thanks to Lauren for helping us through all the technology and keeping us organized. So I, as Lissa said, I'm the Executive Director of the North Star Fund, and North Star is New York City's community foundation supporting grassroots groups leading the movement for equality, economic justice, and peace. We do three things at North Star Fund. We organize, network, and support donors who give to grassroots organizing and activism in New York City and kind of the progressive movement nationally more broadly. We have a grant-making program and technical assistance program to grassroots activists and organizing groups that are led by people directly affected by injustice in the 5 boroughs and surrounding area. And thirdly, we spend a lot of time within philanthropy trying to promote the notion that philanthropy needs to think more deeply about transformation of our society to sort of the better world that is at the heart of what the Switzer Family Foundation does. In terms of my relationship to the Switzer network, I love it. I had my bread buttered for 5 years, first as a grad student at Clark University looking at fishery systems in the Gulf of Maine, particularly the Pandalis borealis fishery, and looking at the construction of scientific knowledge and fisher knowledge around what was happening in terms of the fisheries crisis in the U.S. and globally. But really focusing on local industry. And then I worked at the New York City Environmental Justice Alliance for several years, where I was a Leaders Fellow supported with an Environmental Leaders Fellowship from Switzer. And that's how I got to know Kolu. She supported our work trying to get more green open space, parkland, and gardens created in the 5 boroughs. So our goals for this call were really to create an opportunity for those of us that are in the Fellows Network to really understand more deeply how funders are engaging and organizing themselves in the food system transformation space, and to give you all an opportunity to think about how your work fits into the landscape of funders and how you can begin to network more effectively. I think when I was on the review panel for last year's Fellows program, those of us that were doing the interviews were all saying again that we still kind of remember fondly that moment when we were invited into the network and supported with money and all feeling like, how the heck did this happen, and am I really worthy given all these smart people around me? So I think this is really an important effort for us to begin to partner with Switzer and the network to think about how we leverage all the support that we got over the years. And that's really why I'm enthusiastic about this call today. did anybody want to shoot Lauren or anyone else questions right now to make sure that Virginia, Kolu, and I cover what you all might want to hear? And Lauren, if so, I think you'll probably referee that, correct?
That's correct, I will. As the questions come in and you all take breaks, I'll be passing them along to you, and then at the end of the webinar, we'll have time for live questions.
Terrific. So I first wanted to turn to my buddy Virginia Clark, who I have just come to esteem greatly. Virginia is one of the leaders within philanthropy. One of the most important things to understand about what's happening is this move toward affinities and affinity groups within philanthropy. I think that has come out of, in many ways, the desire for funders to move past their individual mission and strategic focus to try and think about how we leverage resources collectively to do social change work, and in this case, to transform the food system to be more local, regional, organic, sustainable. And for Kolu and I, who created the Community Food Funders, which is a project to organize funders in the New York region, as Alyssa said, to think about equity at the heart of these discussions, because too often we talk about ecology or economics without thinking about who wins and who loses in a social change or environmental or resource management framework. So I wanted to ask Virginia to say a little bit more about her background if she wanted to, and then Virginia, if you could tell us more about the Sustainable Ag and Food Systems Funders Group, how and why it formed, and really what motivates the membership of SAFSIF to be involved in its work.
Okay, now I'm unmuted. Hi there. I'm delighted to be here in Mountain, California, and actually today is a rainy Southern California day, which is really nice because we desperately need the rain. I'm very happy and honored to be part of this conversation. We were talking just before we opened up that Kolu and I have now known each other for 10 years. Hugh and I almost as long, and Kolu and I we're talking about how we have raised our babies together in this movement. It's actually very exciting. My background is kind of all over the map, and what's fun about this job is that it has brought together a lot of international work that I've done in education and in programming, kind of event programming, working with immigration and helping to immigrate and make residents, U.S. residents, for California farm workers primarily, a stint at the World Bank, lots of work in and around the food system, from doing dishes to waiting tables to having a catering business. So this kind of pulls together most of my background, which is really fun. As Hugh and Alyssa said, this is, there is an affinity group for funders pretty much about every issue you can name and then some. And the exciting thing is over the last 10 years or so, the affinity groups have really been working together to try and get funders to see the interconnections between all of the different issues. This particular funders group started, and actually before my time, Kolu was involved in the early stages of this group in kind of the late 90s, and it was really a handful of funders who realized that they were all funding food and ag issues and started talking. Became a more formal working group of the Environmental Grantmakers Association in 2000. I started in January of 2003, and it was interesting timing because it was just after the Farm Bill, the 2002 Farm Bill. It was when mad cows started kind of really hitting the press and all sorts of other things. And so it was, I think, kind of serendipitous that all of these things kind of came together and people started paying attention to these issues. It made things a lot easier to kind of gain traction. We are not a 501c3. We're a fiscally sponsored project at New Venture Fund, and we're not a grant-making entity. So, we don't have funds to give out. We're not there to hook people up much as many people would love for us to do that. We're a fairly small staff. We've got 2.5 staff. We're based in Santa Barbara. We have a steering committee, which is fabulous, really energetic network of folks, and that has been really a tremendous gift, both for the staff as well as for the network. And how it's structured is that we have a number of different committees, and people have really stepped up, I would say, in the last, particularly in the last few years, as the network has grown. When I started, we had 5 supporting funders. We just approved the 74th member last week. We have more than doubled our membership in the last 2.5 years. So, which I think speaks to the interest in this arena. We have individual donors, we have community foundations, we have large and small private family foundations, et cetera, and so it's a really interesting mix of types of funders. We have many re-granters as well. We provide a whole series of programs, both through calls and webinars. We did a call series around Farm Bill issues. We had one about the Farm Bill visualization tool through Johns Hopkins. If you're not familiar with that tool, it's a really interesting piece of work. And we have done a lot of work in cooperation with other affinity groups, particularly with the Environmental Grantmakers Association, with the Grantmakers in Health. We have a new project with Grantmakers in Health to really bring together those funders who are working at the Food Ag Health Nexus. And it has been really interesting to see how kind of when that light bulb goes off for funders that don't think of themselves as having anything to do with the food system or particularly with agriculture, and then they've realized, oh, I see how this is connected up. I've been funding farmland preservation, but never gave a thought to the agriculture or to the food that comes off that actual land, or to the health funders who are doing obesity work but didn't really kind of go upstream. We do an
Virginia, could you say a word about those categories that Sustainable Ag and Food Systems funders fall into, and then a little bit more about what motivates the membership? For the most part, is it mostly about agriculture and agricultural practice, or is the trend in your membership toward questions like the links between the silo of sustainable ag and public health, and, for example, the treatment of workers in the food system?
I will have a much better idea about kind of the trends. At this point, we've got one of the things that has happened over the last couple of years is that we've developed a series of study groups. And so we've got 4 active study groups now, one on economic development, one on policy, one on finance and investment, and one on urban ag. We are, at this point, querying members this spring. We will be putting out a membership directory precisely so that we are able to identify where members are funding, which strategies they're using, which are the kind of categories that they're going after. We have, I would say, a number that come at it through an environmental lens, a number that come at it through a smart growth lens, growing membership that are coming at it through a health lens. But it really, and what motivates them is really learning about how other funders are coming to these issues. I would say one of the roles that we have played, particularly with the smaller family funds, is that they don't have staff or they don't have the opportunity to really learn and network, and they're kind of, lots of them are starting over. They keep starting from scratch and kind of reinventing the wheel. So what we try and do is connect them, is if they have an interest in urban ag or they have an interest in X, Y, or Z, is that we connect them to more funders within the network that have already kind of gone through that process, have talked to their trustees, have changed their strategies, have done all of that, so that they don't have to do it on their own. And they're like, and I know Hugh, you'll be talking more. Hugh and Kola will be talking more about the community food funders, but there has been a growing number of local or regional funder networks. People are really recognizing the need and the leverage that can come from pulling the funders together that are in a regional space. So there is the Roots of Change Fund in California, and there's a Bay Area funders network that's working. Fresh Taste, which is in Illinois, which is a kind of a conglomeration of city, state, private funds, family foundations, et cetera. There's a group in Minnesota that's coming together, in Virginia, in North Carolina. There's one in Philly. So there's a growing number. There's actually Vermont. There's a growing number of funders in the New England area that are coming together because people really see that that's that's where they can probably have the most leverage, and that they absolutely need to know what.
And Virginia, can I ask you, and I hope this doesn't embarrass you, but is there a list of those yet that we could make available to the fellows so that folks know in their area if there's a group that's formed?
I can certainly put one together,
Okay,
and they're not all of them are kind of formal networks. So, you know, we've been doing, and this kind of came up organically when we were putting together our Minneapolis meeting last year, is that we were meeting funders in Minnesota that didn't know about each other. So we suggested that they, you know, have lunch together or, you know, some kind of gathering because they were all doing work around this. And so we ended up helping to kind of co-sponsor an event, which we have now done in Virginia. We'll be doing one in North Carolina in a couple weeks. And that has actually served both in Minnesota and in Virginia to launch a whole series of work that those funders are now taking on that we have nothing to do with, but just kind of help spark a conversation.
So lastly, Virginia, I wanted to ask you, many of the Fellows Network roughly falls into folks who live more in a science realm and then folks who live more in an advocacy, applied, environmental remediation, land conservation, you name it, kind of the basket of thoughtful environmental work. And then there's a group that has a foot in each basket, as it were. Can you talk a little bit about, to the extent you know, how the Sustainable Ag and Food Systems Funders membership breaks down in terms of those two baskets of funding research, whether it's strictly scientific research or applied research, and then sort of the more advocacy, conservation, preservation side in the nonprofit sector?
Yeah, interesting. I would say that there is a growing number of folks who are interested in research and recognize the need for supporting more research. There are very few that I know of that are actively supporting that. That may be changing over the next while. I don't know, but there's definitely a recognition that A, more research is needed, B, it's really key, perhaps even more than new research, is to identify the research that's already been done, and that has been become really apparent when other funders have kind of done research that actually was already done. And so as we're bringing in these different kinds of funders, the health funders or the smart growth funders, is that they don't realize that all this other work exists. So to the extent that this network of fellows knows about existing research, I would really encourage you to, you know, let us know, or as new research comes out, if there's kind of a who's who of researchers, or there is a list that you all can identify of really seminal research pieces. I would love to know about them. We have a pretty good resources section on our website. We're always looking for more you know, material to put up there. That's a really good way. But I would say primarily folks the funders are funding advocacy work, and not necessarily just around conservation, but or preservation, but, you know, kind of a wide spectrum of areas.
Great. And the other thing that fellows could be doing is, in addition to looking at the website, can they be sending you and Bridget updates that might go into the monthly? If you could talk for a second around the communications plan that Sustainable Ag and Food Systems Funders operates.
Yeah, I would say that there's kind of two things. One is that we do a listserv every couple of weeks that goes out to about 400 funders. Includes information about calls that we're doing, you know, events, that kind of stuff. But it also includes information about new reports, publications, articles, events that other people are having that might be of interest, because we have funders literally spread out throughout the country, up into Canada, and a number of funders internationally. Is that's really important. You can also, I would encourage this group to really talk to your funders and to maybe even share your funders that are supporting your work, because the chances are good that not all of them are connected up with this network, and I'm certainly not interested in poaching your funders in any kind of financial way, but there is a real benefit to networking the funders together. So if folks are interested in doing that, I would love to see that. You know, I might be able to kind of hook them into funders that are in your region. And like I said, that has been really helpful both for us as well as for the people who are doing the work in a particular area.
So that's also an opportunity for me to put in a plug to the fellows who are listening to update your profile on the Switzer network. I can tell you that at North Star, I've had a couple of people who got in touch with me because they saw me on that wonderful website that Switzer has developed. So keeping that current in terms of your funder cultivation and development framework is a really valuable resource. Thanks, Virginia. And we'll come back to you. And I think, Virginia, at some point I would like you to talk about the Convergence partnership and more about sort of how the affinity groups are working together. But now I want to turn more to kind of what's actually happening in the field, the practitioner side, the advocate side, the researcher side, and to Kolu, and ask Kolu if you could talk you know, big picture in terms of the 3 or 4 major barriers that you think about in terms of your 15 to 20 years of working on this issue. What are the barriers to a more sustainable, equitable food system?
Hi. Okay.
Not a big question.
Yeah. Right. So this is, you know, it probably could be a much longer list, but the first barrier that I would cite is the very strong interests that are vested in the status quo that wield tremendous influence over policymakers, the research agenda that gets directly funded by corporate interests that are, you know, food and beverage industry, and wields tremendous influence over the marketplace via, you know, these big budgets for advertising, and even what some people call predatory marketing. And secondly, you know, directly related to the power of those interests that are vested in the status quo is the mythologizing that they promulgate that creates a dominant narrative that, you know, is hard not to be influenced by, that limits thinking about the food system and how it might be different. And I think right now the dominant narrative is that with a growing world population, we have to have the most efficient food production system possible, and that equates with a monoculture-based food system that's, you know, expanding reliance on chemical-dependent and bioengineered varieties and the inputs and all that entails. And so that's the story now that's really, despite the growth of the organic sector and despite the interest that consumers have in knowing the face of their farmer, there's a lot of, I think, acceptance of this idea that we have to go down this other road because of fact. And even though there's been evidence to the contrary, the power of those vested interests means that they're able to quell research that shows that agroecological methods and that alternative methods can produce as much or can be as productive. So those studies don't get the prominence that they deserve. And then I would say the lack of visibility, you know, thirdly, of the costs of this dominant mainstream food system. So we see them, but the causality of where these problems come from is not always so evident. So, and then oftentimes we don't even see the impact. So for example, the impact of pesticides on farm workers. I mean, my colleague does a reproductive rights program, and some of our board members were asking her about what about impacts on farm worker men and their fertility. And we were kind of thinking back, yeah, I remember stories about alligator penises getting smaller, but, you know, so people are concerned sometimes with impacts of things like pesticides on animals, but they don't even think about, you know, what are the human costs, and oftentimes the human costs are in populations that are marginal and not really counted, not visible for the average, you know, the average American. same with impacts like fertilizer runoff and the prophylactic use of antibiotics in animal feed. People may feel the impact of, their antibiotic-resistant infection, but to tie that to factory farms is a stretch, and maybe not front of mind. And then lastly, and there's a lot packed under this one, is our structural and systemic barriers that affect really all sectors in our society, so including agriculture and food systems. And they include, there's probably a longer list, but I'll just name a few. So the regulatory framework that around environmental protection that at core is about enabling corporations to exploit nature if they do their permitting applications correctly. A legal framework that doesn't really recognize the intrinsic value of ecosystems, but only property values. A constitutional framework that's been interpreted by our courts in ways that give corporations the same rights as living, breathing people, and makes it difficult for local democracies, communities to ban corporate practices that they deem undesirable. And the existence of structural racism, which enables industry-wide exploitation of people of color, but also of women. And I think that that's particularly prevalent within the food system and within the founding of the U.S. food system, in terms of our history with the triangle trade and plantation agriculture really being built along the slave model, and then the legacy of worker exploitation and farm worker exploitation and public policies that really enabled and supported that as part of U.S. history. So those are some of the structural and systemic barriers.
Thanks, Kolu. And I wanted to, in reference to the opening things that Kolu was saying, there's an article on the front page of today's Business Day in the Times about the battle over genetically modified corn and weed killers that really, I think, very quickly gives you a specific case that Kolu is talking about. So, Kolu, could you talk a little bit more about, because you've had a front row seat for this, what you're learning about how systems change has happened within the sustainable ag and food system space, where research has played a role, and what are some of the lessons that have been learned by funders over the last 15, 20 years that sustainable ag and food systems funders has been in existence. And I want to sort of, for those on the call who don't know, Virginia and Kolu until the last really 3 to 5 years were on a pretty lonely street within philanthropy. There wasn't a lot of funders in this space, and it's been really interesting for me to watch as funders have realized that the food system is really a place where lots of their silos connect, how they've struggled to understand what's been learned and what has come before them. So could you talk a little bit about that, please, Kolu?
Sure, let's see. Well, looking back over the 12 years that I've been in philanthropy, one of the things that I've observed is that there's been a shift from really focusing on what's happening inside the farm gate and thinking that, a more sustainable food system means more sustainable farming practices, which it does, and there was a lot of attention on biodynamic farming and agroecology, organic agriculture, diversified family farming, etc. But eventually, I think people, starting with the farmers themselves, and then, the nonprofits that they worked with and the funders that funded the nonprofits, realized that what happens inside the farm gate is connected to what happens in the marketplace, and that the dominant market and federal policy wasn't rewarding good farm practices. And to get them to spread, we had to stimulate and create new market channels. So, conscientious consumers who care about where their food comes from and read labels. Institutional procurement policies that facilitate the purchase of local food, et cetera. And policy incentives to spread good practices so that farmers could be rewarded for using ecologically sound practices that help to, protect water quality, et cetera. So that work is still spreading. So in other words, it was really a broadening, I think. So a realization that it's not just food groups, it's not just consumer groups, it's policy. And then from there, a recognition that, the way that the industry is structured with some horizontal and vertical integration of the food companies and corporations, we started to understand that the processors are demanding these uniform vegetables, so now if you want to have local agriculture and organic agriculture, maybe we have to move away from processors who can only deal with tomatoes that are a certain hardness and a certain size. And so, bringing into perspective the need to really look at the entire food chain, food supply chain, and that seems to have been one of the kinds of awareness that we as funders really were, I think, challenged to develop, a greater in terms of systems change. And I think the other sort of overarching thing is just that systems change necessitates being bold. I mean, you really don't change systems just by being polite and funding good research. I mean, you can have great research and great ideas, but if there's nobody at the end of the day to not only advocate for them, but to do on-the-ground organizing and get mad and get media attention and push for change, it's not going to happen because of what I said before about vested interests that benefit from the status quo. And I think that philanthropy is often very comfortable with large players, big organizations, multi-million-dollar nonprofits. And we have to look at who's sponsoring these organizations. What are the industry sponsorship relationships? Who's on the governing board? We had an experience, I don't know if it was a couple years ago now, with an attempt to push through a soda tax. And there were many nonprofit organizations that had big beverage industry funding and representatives on their governing boards who, were not free to advocate for the soda tax, and it didn't go anywhere. And I think that funders can do more to write into their guidelines provisions that require transparency about food and beverage industry ties, and to make clear that they're not going to fund groups that are hamstrung by such ties. And the reason I say that, I know that's very specific, is because I think in terms of systems change, we're not going to get it if we're mainly funding big organizations that have those kinds of ties. They're not going to be able to advocate for the really deep change that needs to happen.
So I want to ask both of you a final question because we're at time to open it up to folks who are listening on the call, and I'm hoping there's some good questions out there, you guys. But something Kolu said spoke to me about for Virginia and Kolu, for both of you to understand. I think if there's one thing that has really embodied or represented the Switzer Family Foundation's commitment to environmental leadership, it is that they find people who make those connections and who look at systems. So I wanted to ask you both, could you talk a little bit more about how your experience seeing funders self-organize around food systems work? And are there any networking lessons or network lessons for the Switzer network and how fellows should be talking about communicating their ability to make the connections that Kolu said. You know, one of the things that funders within SAFSIF are realizing is that you can't, if you have your hand on just one part of the elephant, we're not really going to change or transform the food system, right? So if you could, either for fellows who are working in academia or the nonprofit and advocacy sector, in government or in the private sector, what do you think the best ways for fellows to communicate their work is? And then, Virginia, I want you to talk specifically about the Convergence Partnership before we open it up to the floor.
Am I on?
Okay, you want to go first, Virginia?
Yeah, I was going to say there's a couple things that I just wanted to kind of point out. One is that I think, you know, one of the ways that we have found to be most expedient and most effective at getting the funders to see how all these different pieces fit together is through what we call kind of reality tours. And we don't necessarily look for the big organizations or the big speakers, the, you know, Alice Waters or the Michael Pollins. We look for the people who are on the ground to then tell those stories. And they're, you know, I've been really privileged and honored to be able to do these meetings that we do for the last 10 years around the country. And so we have this incredible network, and I know that there is just phenomenal work going on across the country. And we really get people out into it so that they see it, they smell it, they taste it, and it kind of becomes a very visceral experience. To the extent possible, I know that there's, we're working with one of the fellows in, the Switzer Fellows in the Central Valley. We're doing a tour this June in the Central Valley, which will be, I think, an amazing eye-opening experience because it really is going to speak to the industrialization of agriculture. In ways that people, I think, are not expecting. I think in terms of network lessons is that the more open and willing one is to share your experience with other folks in your network or those who are kind of coming to you for expertise. Within this network, there's just an amazing amount of depth. I would really talk to your funders about, if there are funders specifically around this issue, to connect them up with our network. I think that there are ways that we could make use of the Switzer Fellows network and your expertise at a whole variety of different meetings. You know, each one of the funder meetings has workshops, and they put out call for, you know, workshop submissions, et cetera. And because food and agriculture is such a hot topic, we are getting multiple requests for to submit something, and that's with the funders, you know, the kind of the smart growth funders, certainly grant makers in health, education funders. We're working with grant makers in aging. There's all kinds of opportunities. So don't, you know, the spectrum is really wide open. And definitely keep us informed, keep me informed about what you're doing, so that we can in turn get that word back out. In terms of the kind of the Convergence Partnership, the National Convergence Partnership is one of 3 organizations, SAFSF being one and Grant Makers in Health, that have come together around in this project called Creating Common Ground for those who are working at the food, ag, health nexus. And I would say there is tremendous growth. There has been tremendous growth, and there's huge potential and huge opportunities within the health funding realm. Lots and lots and lots of funders are working on, you know, obesity prevention, diet, chronic disease. A lot of them are getting into community gardens and wellness programs. A lot of them are working on school food, both, you know, from kind of the on-the-ground changing food and procurement to major policy change. And there are, like I said, I think that that's going to be an area of just huge potential going forward.
Kolu, did you have anything you wanted to add to what Virginia said about how fellows can project their work to funders?
Yeah, I would just add the more local regional association of grant makers that exists. So in New York, we have an organization called Philanthropy New York, and that the programming that those associations do oftentimes will include some something related to the food and ag space. I think every year in New York there's always some kind of program that gets organized by some member. And the other thing in general about networking, I don't know about this millennial generation or or people who are fellows, but I know when I was younger and I thought of networking, I thought of like very self-motivated, a way to promote your career, which may be part of it, but it's also an important piece for any institution because of what you were saying about the elephant before. The complexity of social and environmental problems means that more institutions and funders are recognizing the need to collaborate, that no one has enough resources or perspective or experience to significantly impact problems alone. And so networking is the way to make those relationships happen, and it takes time to establish trust that can lead to collaboration or sharing, and time is money. And so I would just encourage people to, the fellows on the phone, to do whatever you can to make it a formal part of your work experience, your internship, or whatever is your work experience. I know at the Noyce Foundation, it started out as an informal kind of part of our job that wasn't really part of our job description, that added a lot of value because by working with other funders, we were able to lift up grantees that were doing exciting work and things like that. And eventually, the board caught on that this was a real big value add of Noyce Foundation staff, and now it's a very formal part of our job description. We call it field presence, and it gets reported to our board quarterly. Really every interaction that we have, like a formal interaction, whether it's a breakfast meeting or, and then we break it down. Did we play a planning role? Did we play a leadership role? Were we a speaker? And it also gets broken down in terms of cost of the staff time. So because it's so recognized, then it becomes part of our strategy for change, and I think we're still evolving how to make the most of it, but I would just say, encourage your organization to support that work that you do with other institutions.
Thanks so much. So we're going to move to questions now, and I understand from Lauren, who's sending me urgent texts over my little GoToWebinar control panel. There's a question from Drew Conroy about large-scale farms that are in family hands for decades or even centuries. Lauren, do you want to take it from here?
Sure. So I have the, yeah, thank you, Hugh. I have the text version here, but I actually just messaged Drew. Let me just turn Drew's mic on, and maybe he could ask it himself, because it's a good question, but I think it would be best in his own words. Drew, do you have a headset that you could use? Your mic is live. Oh, he might not actually have a headset. Let me go ahead and start reading it. And Drew, if you want to, oh, he says he's on an old desktop. Okay, let me unmute him again, and I'll go ahead and read it for you. So this is from Drew Conroy, who actually teaches agriculture students, and he says that might put him a bit outside the realms that you mentioned earlier, Hugh, but he teaches students who cumulatively have tens of thousands of acres, thousands of livestock, and who feed many, many people. And they have farms that have been in their families for decades, or in some cases even centuries. And he says there's often this idea by the general public that they're not sustainable, but he says I would challenge us to find other natural resource-based businesses that have been more sustainable or long-term in their thinking. So beyond his comment, he says, I wonder, after listening to Virginia and then also Kolu, if the strategies of committees and funders include agricultural producers who are not environmentalists per se, smaller urban farmers or health and policy people. In addition, if there is advocacy, what type of advocacy for the people who feed our masses? And also, let me just follow up, because he had a follow-up comment to that question after Kolu spoke, and he says that that talking about factory farms is, especially for those of us doing agriculture in the New England area, he said, is often like a slap in the face, as many farms have grown and used many sustainable practices. He says, I recognize the issues she mentioned, but they may not be systemic across the industry, and it can create divisions and coalitions that counter the environmental push. In any case, he says, many farmers want a positive image, but even today's statements would not have been viewed in a positive light by even the most environmentally moderate farmers in my area. And just so you all know, these questions were on hold for a little bit, so he's referring back to what Virginia and Kola mentioned about 15 minutes ago. So I would just open it up to Virginia's comments maybe on the first part, and then Kola's comments on the second part. And let me
question, where is Drew? I'm just curious that in terms of a regional perspective, but I think that there's absolute recognition that family farms, not only are they an economic model, and that they are those who have gone for generations in particular, and they are a critical piece of the whole landscape, and that it's, at least with the funders that I know, there are some who would advocate that it all needs to be very small, very local, very organic, et cetera. I would say the bulk of the funders that we are involved with, or that are involved in our network, recognize that there is a huge spectrum, and that those family farms that are, there is no kind of perfect system, but that they are really critical. And I would thank you at the University of New Hampshire, and the family farm ideal, or the kind of the model that I understand in New England, is on a very different scale than, for example, the family farm that I saw in the Central Valley last week, which is hundreds of thousands of acres. Yes, it's owned by one family. It's still considered a family business, but it is, in my mind, at least in my perspective, it's anything but a kind of how I envision a family operation. It's a multinational corporation that happens to be in family hands. I would say that they are, like I said, it's a critical piece of the landscape. Mm-hmm. And I'm really grateful that there's somebody who is teaching students, and there are a lot of folks who are trying to get into this work, whether it's through farming or through agriculture, and it's the university level participation and involvement is we have to have good people who are teaching and moving that forward.
Kolu, did you want to add anything?
Yeah, I'll say something. So one of the groups that we fund is the National Family Farm Coalition, and for many years the president of that organization was a man named George Naylor, who's still an active member, and he's a corn producer in Iowa, and his farm is not, sustainable, and he doesn't. Unlike the farm family that the fellow is talking about, he does not claim that it was sustainable, and yet he's part of our movement for a more sustainable food system. And it's not really a contradiction, because when you have a structural when you have a structure of policies and the marketplace and even infrastructure that is all geared towards a certain type of production model, it's only logical that there are going to be, actually a majority of players who are part of that model, and you can't just expect them all to be practicing some other kinds of agriculture. And that was one of the really powerful things about having him be president of the National Family Farm Coalition. He wanted to not use chemicals. He didn't want to expose himself to herbicides. But he did, because that was the model of agriculture that he was practicing. So that's different from the family farm that you're talking about. But I think the point that I want to make is that it's really not about castigating people engaged in livestock production or grain production or whatever kind of production they're involved in, but to look systemically and say, do we have a common vision where, and what do we think sustainability means? And how do we get there? How do we all get there? So we look at the breadbasket of the United States, and if we agree that there's too much nitrogen fertilizer runoff going into the Mississippi River and too much dependence on petroleum, what's the plan for a transition? It's similar to the energy sector, where we know that we can't continue to just be dependent on non-renewable energy sources, and so there has to be a plan for a transition to something that's more sustainable. sustainability is a moving target. So it's not. I'm not interested in having an argument about what exactly does it look like, but I'm interested in having a conversation that really engages everyone about how can we begin to move in the right direction together and support that with public policies and through market-based solutions, et cetera.
And I would just add quickly, I really appreciate the question. Two things. One, I think we have to be careful. Anybody who gets over-romanticized, they're in the process of over-romanticization in this, in this instance of smaller-scale family farms. There's also very real, race, class, and power dynamics behind some of these things, and I think for family farmers to survive, and I'm thinking, Virginia and Kolu, of the great guy who presented in Minneapolis, who's the head of the Minnesota Family Farm Network, and him, it was a session on the food movement, and he was talking about how he and his members have really had to move out of their comfort zone of their tradition as family farmers to understand how they connect to other social movements, because their model of farming and their desire to have a community-based approach to agriculture and not just be a cog in the agro-industrial complex, is partly a function of being able to build power with labor, with people of color movements, with worker movements. So I think I know the Hudson Valley pretty well, and we tried to do a tour for funders a few years ago on the food system, and we got a lot of resistance from upstate farmers around including worker rights in part of our discussion. And most of the folks were, fine with it, but there were a couple people who just don't believe that the goal here is to do what Kolu just said, which is to think together about what are the kind of communities and regions and ecosystems that we want to practice our farming in, right? So I think I totally agree with Drew that we want to be careful and not to castigate, but I think we all have to challenge ourselves and move out of our comfort zone if we're going to transform the system for everybody, as Kolu said. Lauren, you said there was another question that someone had put.
We have several more, and Drew actually commented back, and I'll send that to you privately so that you've got that comment. It's a little awkward, I know. GoToWebinar is not ideal for discussion, but it's what we've got, so it's what we use. Let me go ahead and move on to the next question. This is from Enid Wanacott, who lives in Vermont and is the executive director of the Organic Farming Association for the state. And her question is, and Hugh, I'll let you direct it to someone to answer. She says, there are many funders that want applicants to address the root causes of issues, hunger, environmental disruption, etc. But I've found as a program director that there are often several stages of work that have to be done prior to being able to address the root causes. How can I best represent this with funders?
I would, Kolu, do you want to start with that since you entertain proposals from folks like our colleague who asked the question? And then Virginia, if you have anything to add.
Yeah, and then you probably should answer too, because my guess is that you have a sense. But I mean, what I would say is, be firm in sharing your theory of change or your organization's theory of change. So it may be that in order to address the root causes of an issue, you have to have a strong constituency. And in order to develop a strong constituency, you need to do some service provision to engage people. And then as you do that, you also do leadership development or other things. So you just need to be proactive to explain how you think change happens and where the impact on the root cause of a problem then happens.
Virginia, did you want to add anything?
I was just going to say that I think that it's oftentimes people, when applying for grants or applying for money, kind of do it in a way that they think the funder is asking about, rather than kind of, as Kolu said, putting forward and being strong in what you feel is really needed. The funders that were in this space, I think, are really struggling with, they see the need for the systems change, and they are also struggling on how to make that happen and how to have the biggest impact and how to respond to their own, particularly the staff, how to respond to their own trustees and their own boards that may change direction, come a couple of years or a few years, and so, see the funders as partners would be something that I would definitely strongly advocate.
And I would just add, I think part of the reality of this as a new space in which funders are organizing themselves, I'll give you a story. So we were at the steering committee, Kolu and I, of the Community Food Funders, which is the funders organizing project that Kolu and I have started in the New York, New Jersey, and Southern Connecticut region to try and get funders organized. Because I think one of the fundamental issues is that your question is speaking to is that the field, the practitioners, advocates, researchers are way ahead of funders generally, because philanthropy traditionally has not been organized to work in the sustainable ag and food system space. Environmental funders thought about environment. They didn't think about farming was considered a, as we know, that wasn't quote unquote environmental. And healthcare funders came out of a much more traditional kind of disease community health, and not, it's shockingly very recent that we've come to understand what the links are between individual health, community health, public health, and our food system. So we were in this meeting the other day, and some of our colleagues from the Doris Duke Charitable Foundation, which is a traditional environment, arts, and I forget what I think disease funder, they were talking about, at the program staff level, they're very committed to what you're talking about, which is laying the groundwork, but they have a certain framework that program staff operates under. And I think for those on the call and those who already understand it, I apologize, but for those who don't, there's often a almost firewall between program staff, who tend to be from the field and really interested in working with grantees and trying to support you all in innovative ways, and then trustees, who tend to be more conservative and want to have a clear vision and a focus, maybe politically conservative. And so our colleagues at Doris Duke have been in a really interesting conversation with their trustees, but they've had to fit their sustainable ag and food systems work. They've had to, in their own philanthropic way, kind of set some pieces in place and have to operate within the parameters that they already have. So I think that may be part of what you're also coming up against in terms of your conversations with funders, is a little bit of how they currently understand their theories of change, and then how food systems work fits into that, and how they communicate that to their trustees and their boards to get their list of groups that they're willing to fund and their strategies funded. Lauren, did we have other questions or comments?
Oh, we do. We have a bunch. And I did just want to mention, both Virginia and Co. said that they could stay past 2 o'clock. Yeah, Hugh, can you stay on for a little bit longer?
I believe so. I just have to look at my, but go ahead.
Let me go ahead. I'll go
Yeah,
to the next question.
We
have in local farming capability.
Let me turn this down. I've got a webinar I'm recording.
Okay.
Oh.
It's okay. I just went ahead and muted.
Speaker. I'm muted, so it doesn't matter.
Okay.
Hugh, you're actually not.
At least I better.
You're actually not muted right now. I can hear you.
Let's do room tax. Let's do everything.
Hugh?
Okay.
I'm sorry. Can everybody hear Hugh, or is it just me?
No, it's everybody can hear him.
Do you have adult movies?
Everybody can hear him.
I'll really fight with it. I see any of
I
those.
have no way to to mute him. If somebody has his phone number, maybe you could let him know.
I will do that.
Thanks. So the question was, urban universities can play a critical role in reskilling city dwellers in local farming capability, yet rarely have funds for university farms or gardens. What funding sources are targeted for capital investment in teaching farms at urban city center universities?
Okay, they can hear me. Can you give me a number and I can call you back?
Oh, sure. It's 415-835.
Sorry, everybody.
475. And if you don't mind, I'm going to go to lunch. So after 12, I can call you back if that's okay?
That would be perfect.
Okay. Have a good webinar, and I'll talk to you at 12.
Usually your phone can mute you. You don't have to be muted by... done by a university on any farm. So it's more having the funds to support the research. If it makes sense to have the research located on university land, then that may be the case. But I know at least in New York City, there's some interesting urban farm opportunities, including incubator farmland that is publicly controlled, that may allow for a productive research partnership. But I don't.
Muted.
One of the contexts that I think everyone needs to understand is that while there are some funders that have huge endowments that could be directing more money into this area, the economic crisis has reduced foundation endowments, I don't know, maybe by 20% overall, and then some foundations it's more. And so this is where advocacy becomes important, and what should the public sector really be supporting? Because it's not likely that, and Virginia, please chime in if you feel a little bit differently, but to me it's not likely that private foundations can take over or fill a gap that would otherwise be something that would be more in the public domain.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I would say, the good news is that they are recognizing both within the public domain and the kind of the private investment sector, as well as the foundation philanthropic community, is the critical need for them to be working together, and that with lots of different cuts, the foundation endowments have been cut, the government budgets have been cut, is that there are ways that they can piece things together and have far greater impact than if they try and do it on their own. And so there actually is a big push on kind of public-private partnerships, and that's happening within research, it's happening within advocacy, it's happening in new farmer programs, it's happening on lots and lots of different fronts.
Lauren, I'm back on.
Wait,
I had my phone muted, and I think
Hugh.
you thought it was me talking in the background, but it wasn't.
Oh.
I got iced, but it
you got iced? I'm so sorry. I thought that was you. That was somebody else. Okay.
It was Don.
Sorry. Welcome back. I'm glad you're back.
Thanks.
So let me turn actually to Lisa, who's got a question. She's going to ask hers live. Lisa, go ahead. You're unmuted. Lisa, can you hear us? All right, well, I'll go ahead and mute her. We'll come right back to you, Lisa, and I'll help her out in the meantime. So I'm just looking back through our next questions. Let's see. So we've got a number of questions and comments that are actually more appropriate for our listserv. So what we're going to do is we'll make sure that all of the questions and comments are put there tonight and tomorrow so that people can go back and forth. Kira is saying that she also wanted to share. She's working for a foundation that's launching a new multi-donor international fund for Amplify. Oh, this is a long name. I'm not going to try and read it. But she is seeking collaborative partnerships on a lot of levels, and she'd be happy to speak in more detail with either funders or fellows, which that'll be great.
I would love to be put in touch. This is Virginia.
Great. Great. Hey, Virginia. So I think I actually think that we've worked through the questions that we had. Oh, Lisa just posted again, so let me see if I can get Lisa on the line. Hang on just one second. It looks like she's dialing in with her phone, which would be great. Go ahead, Hugh.
Do you have Lisa's question, Lauren? We'll end with her question, and then I was going to invite Kolu and Virginia to share the one thing they forgot to say that they really want to say, and then I just have some closing comments.
So I'm having a hard time getting Lisa on. I'm not able to mute or unmute her. So I'd say, Lisa, I apologize. We'll go ahead and get your question answered via email from folks, and we'll make sure we put that on the listserv as well. I'm sorry that we ran over, but I would definitely love to hear the one thing that they forgot to say that they're dying to say. So I'll get off.
Kolu, go for it.
Oh, I don't think I have anything really critical to say. I mean, the one thing I could say is that if you want to broaden your relationship with other funders in the field, to be assertive and make personal contacts, and it's just like any other relationship building. It takes time, and sort of the payoff, which is various. It's not just money, right? Is also going to be long term, hopefully. So just to, don't be shy. I think money, the idea of having a relationship with a foundation sometimes is awkward because I've been in situations where people feel like if they call me, then, either they don't feel comfortable getting to the point where they're asking for money, which is unfortunate because that's my job, or they worry that I'll think they're only calling for money and they really have other reasons. And so there's some kinds of discomfort that folks have to sometimes get over to establish good relationships with folks that work in foundations. And I would just encourage you, if you have any of that, to do your best to get over it, and remember that, that's what we're here for. We're here to give money, but also to facilitate, the exchange of ideas and resources and all of that as well. So we're excited to meet you and get to know you and what you have to offer.
Virginia?
No, I would just echo that, and that, as I said earlier, there's an amazing amount of depth of knowledge and experience within this network, from what I can glean from folks' bios and looking at the organizations that you all are working with. So I would encourage you to definitely keep each other informed, keep us informed. I have a sense that we have a lot of work to do together, which is really exciting. Again, would encourage you to connect your funders up with our network. Many of them are struggling on their own, and there's not really there's no need for that because it's hard enough when we're doing it all together.
Right on. So I just wanted to say a final big picture comment about why Kolu and I felt so strongly about creating community food funders and kind of the values that go into it with respect to philanthropy. And I'll just speak of my own experiences that too often in environmental movement spaces that I was in before I started in philanthropy, and certainly since I've been in philanthropy, there'll be a really interesting discussion about economics, or there'll be a really interesting discussion about ecology. But the social dimensions of our work, particularly the equity and justice implications, we often assume a space that's class neutral or color neutral or gender neutral or orientation neutral. And so I think if we are going to succeed at the transformation, we have to be able to to talk about ecology and economics and the third part of the triple bottom line, or the three-foot stool, the three-legged stool, together, and not kind of come to the question of equity later on, because the transformation could happen, and the folks who are hurting most now could still be hurting at the end of the transformation. And it's really, I think, plays to the strength of the Switzer network and those of us who the foundation has supported over the years to really carry these three parts of these three legs of the stool, to make sure whatever stools we're building, they have all three of those legs at the same time. I wanted to say a practical word, just echoing what Kolu and Virginia said about how philanthropy works. And for me, it's about relationships and then persistence. Be of use to program officers that you're interested, if they're already supporting you or there's somebody you would like to support your work. It's about being a resource for them first, and then finding that right opportunity. At North Star, in our donor work, we talk about building the relationship and finding the right moment to turn that relationship into a resource. And I wanted to emphasize that, you know, philanthropy is very much rooted in that notion of the rugged individualist of American economic history and social history. And it really builds from relationships. It is very much a relationship-driven culture. So I think in addition to coming to understand individual funders and foundations and what their missions are, again, I can't emphasize enough, the trend is definitely towards some of the things that Virginia in particular described about how funders are working together and the kind of resources, the research, the data that they need to be able to be more effective with their boards and build an agenda around sustainable ag and food systems funding. And again, you know, as I said, I think it's about getting funded by a particular program officer and foundation, but it's equally important that people give to people. And so first and foremost, you want to find that personal relationship first, and then find the right moment to ask for the money. But ask for the money, as Kolu said. That's my overarching theme for wanting to organize this call and this webinar. The other thing to understand, for those who don't know this already, program officers are always talking with other program officers and with their grantees to help develop, deepen, revise their funding strategies. And the best funders, and if I may shamelessly put in a plug for the Switzer Family Foundation, stick to a set of strategies over time, but they do change. So building that relationship and understanding how your work fits in kind of the changing trends in the field is always really important, and think of yourself as a resource to your funders as well as somebody that benefits from that relationship. And obviously, as Virginia said and Kolu said, you've got to get out there and network and take time and show up and offer your expertise and your knowledge and your work. And it's like anything else, it's a slog to build these relationships at first if you don't already have them, but once you have them, philanthropists tend to stick with you. Maybe some of the bigger funders seem to be moving the deck chairs more often, but certainly local funders in particular and regional funders are known for staying committed to a set of issues over time. And again, finally, I'll underscore again, the rubber is really meeting the road in terms of its emerging commitment to affinity groups. Affinity groups have been around, but what's happening now, as Virginia mentioned with the Convergence Partnership, is trying to understand the systems and systems connections. And I think that's where each of us as fellows can help preach that gospel and support each other in introducing to each other as funders start to talk to each other and build relationships across their silos. So with that, I'm finished, and I don't know whether Lissa or Lauren wants to wrap us up.
Thank you so much, Hugh. This is Lauren. I will wrap us up. Just quickly to say that the webinar, as well as these couple of slides, will be available on our blog in the next few days. We do have quick ways that you can stay in touch with what's going on with the Switzer Network. They're listed on this slide. They're also all over our website. But mainly what I would like to do is just say thank you so much to Hugh, Kolu, and Virginia. A lot of work went into preparing this webinar, and we are going to take all of the questions and comments that were posted. We'll put them on the Sustainable Agricultural Listserv that we started for our affinity group, speaking of affinity groups, and so that this conversation can continue, because it's a really important topic, and I know that we're not finished in just the short time that we've had today. So thank you everyone for participating. Thank you for continuing to follow along, and now go ask for some of that that money. As you said, don't forget to always ask after you've made those connections. So thank you again, everyone, and have a great day.
The